Soil background is an important factor to consider when conducting human health and ecological risk assessments. Regulators use numerical screening values specific to contaminants commonly found in soil to evaluate potential risks to people and the environment. For some chemicals, the screening value may be within the range of concentrations found in soils from natural or anthropogenic ambient background, because most regulatory agencies do not require action to be taken if the amount of a chemical in soil is within the range of background concentration. Soil background plays an important role in remedial decisions. This is the third video for the Soil Background in Risk Assessment Guidance Document Training. This video will provide an overview of the following topics: the differences and similarities between default and site-specific background, how to use default background in risk assessment. Site-specific background and how it's used in risk assessment will then be discussed. Use of soil background to develop preliminary remedial goals will be presented. We will use a case study to demonstrate how to use soil background in risk assessments. The Soil Background and Risk Assessment guidance can be found on the ITRC website. All training videos are also available on the ITRC website. As a note of caution, while statistics are an important part of the evaluation of a background condition, we are not going to go into a step-by-step discussion on how to perform various statistical evaluations. We will do a high-level summary of what you need to know regarding how statistics may be used in the evaluation of soil background data in risk assessment. More information on how to perform statistics when evaluating soil background is available in Section 11 of the ITRC guidance document. Before we dive in, there are a few things to know. This symbol indicates that we will be discussing a disclaimer or caution. The first caution is to ensure you know the regulatory agency you are working under. Each regulatory agency, be it federal, state, or local, has their own definitions for soil background. Each regulatory agency has their own set of processes and requirements. It is important to coordinate with the regulatory agency you are working under at the start of your project. So remember, check with your regulator first. Let's start with defining default and site-specific background. Default background is generally established by regulatory agencies for larger areas like a state, region, or a unique geological area. A large number of sites located within that area are evaluated using default background to determine if those individual site concentrations are representative of background. For example, many states have developed statewide or regional background values that are used to compare to concentrations from sites that are located in those states or regions. Therefore, default background represents a large number of sites. Site-specific background is generally established by a responsible or voluntary party for one specific site or a few sites. This type of background is more specialized based on the characteristics of a specific site or a few sites in a smaller geographical area. Both default and site-specific background are established using areas that are similar in physical, chemical, geological, and biological characteristics to the site or sites being evaluated. Remember, the difference is that default background is compared to a large number of sites, whereas site-specific background is used to compare to one or a few sites. This means that the area used to represent default background should be generally, and I emphasize generally, similar to all of the many sites that will be evaluated against it, and the area used to represent site-specific background should be more closely, and I emphasize more closely, similar to the one site or a few sites that it will be compared against. Because default background is intended to be used for a large number of sites in a large geographical area, it is generally established to be more conservative. Site-specific background is considered more accurate because it uses information specific to one or a few sites which has a more limited geographical area. Both default and site-specific background can be established for natural and anthropogenic ambient background. Default soil background can be used as a screening tool to determine if contaminant concentrations are generally representative of background concentrations. This is typically done by using a default background threshold value, or a BTV, that is established by a regulatory agency. Default BTVs are compared to site concentrations to determine if the site concentrations represent background. If they do, most regulatory agencies will not require further evaluation. If they do not, regulatory agencies will require further evaluation. If you still think your site concentrations represent background, one option to evaluate further is to establish site-specific background. Please refer to the guidance for more information regarding how to establish default BTVs. Site-specific soil background can be used to establish site-specific soil BTVs and can also be used to compare the site-specific soil background dataset to the site dataset. The use of a site-specific BTV allows you to identify localized contamination. This is most commonly done by comparing the site-specific BTV to each site soil concentration by way of a point-by-point comparison. Comparing the site-specific background dataset to the site dataset using a statistical test allows you to identify slight but pervasive contamination. Regulatory agencies vary regarding what they require. Some do not have default BTVs, and some that do may not have default BTVs for all contaminants. In these cases, some regulatory agencies require you to establish site-specific background. Remember, discuss the use of background data in the risk assessment with the regulatory agency early in the process. Default and site-specific soil background may be established either from an existing soil background study or by conducting a new soil background study. Conducting a new soil background study is the preferred method because this allows you to make sure the study meets your specific goals. Section 9 of the guidance document and Video 2 have more information.
We are going to use a fictitious case study to explain how to use default and site-specific soil background and risk assessment. This case study does not encompass everything within the ITRC guidance document, and some steps may not be applicable to the regulatory agency you are working with. As you can see, there is a facility located in a rural area. East of the facility is vacant land with a stream. Woods and vegetation in this area are similar to that in the facility, and the predominant wind direction is from the east to the west. We'll use this scenario to discuss how to use default and site-specific background in risk assessment. During site characterization, releases from historical operations at the facility were identified. Soil samples were collected at the site, and inorganic and organic contaminants were detected. Site concentrations of some inorganics and organics exceeded their applicable risk-based soil screening values. Arsenic, cobalt, iron, and vanadium are the inorganics. Dioxins and carcinogenic polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or also known as CPAHs, are the organics. Since we think that these concentrations are representative of both natural and anthropogenic ambient background, we decided to evaluate background soil concentrations. We checked with the regulatory agency to see if it had default BTVs, and if you recall, those are background threshold values established to be compared to a large number of sites and used to screen. Since statewide default background values were available, we started by using default BTVs to compare to our site concentrations. Some states may also have regional background data sets. Now we need to make sure that the default BTVs were applicable to our site, so we compared some key characteristics. The default BTV was representative of rural areas, which is where our site was located. And rural areas following wildfires can have higher background concentrations of CPAHs and dioxins. Urban areas can have higher contaminant anthropogenic ambient background concentrations than rural areas. It is also important to note that regulatory agencies define this type of background differently. We didn't identify any site conditions indicating unique geology or mineralogy. It is especially important to consider unique geology and mineralogy at mining sites, where it can be expected that site-specific background for some metals may be necessary. The scope of the default BTVs identified for our site was any sites within the state. As our site was in that state, this fit within the geographic extent of the background study. We also considered some additional items to determine whether it was appropriate to use the default BTV. There were no regional anthropogenic sources, which may not be apparent in a statewide background data set. There were no unique conditions at the site, such as shallow groundwater. Shallow groundwater can impact solubility of some compounds, which in turn may affect background concentrations. Therefore, depth of groundwater should also be considered when reviewing applicability of background data sets. The sample collection methods were similar in the background study to those used at the site. They both used discrete sampling. The analytical methods used were similar, and this included both extraction methods and analysis methods. One important note is that USGS and US EPA analytical methods for inorganics differ and may provide different results. USGS is a total method and in most cases will result in higher concentration than US EPA's methods. If USGS data are used to establish a default BTV, that BTV may not appropriately represent background. This may result in a BTV that is higher than it would be if it were established using results from US EPA's analytical method. Therefore, using a BTV based on USGS's data may not be adequately protective of potential site risks. Please refer to the guidance document for additional information regarding different analysis methods. Now that we know that the default BTV the regulatory agency recommended is appropriate for our site, we need to compare it to our site data. Default BTVs are a single upper bound value. We wanted to make sure we understood the calculations used to develop this value. For example, there are many upper bound statistical values that could be selected: upper prediction limits, upper tolerance limits, and others as discussed in Section 11 of the guidance document. For our case study, the default BTV was calculated using US EPA's Pro-UCL and was based on 112 samples across the state. The BTV is a 95-95 upper tolerance limit, or a 95-95 UTL, which means it represents the 95th percent upper confidence limit on the 95th percentile. All of the contaminant concentrations were compared to the default BTV to determine if any exceeded, and if so, how many and by what magnitude. This type of comparison is often referred to as a point-by-point comparison. If all of the site concentrations, or one could say if the maximum site concentration, are less than the default BTV, site conditions are considered to represent background. If some of the site concentrations exceed the default BTV, additional evaluations comparing the site data set to the default BTV are generally useful before moving into the next step. These additional evaluations include graphical comparisons, spatial comparisons, and the test for proportions. Please refer to Section 11 of the Guidance Manual for additional information on these additional evaluations. In our case study, site concentrations of iron, as well as the maximum site iron concentration, were below default BTVs. For all of the other inorganics, some site concentrations exceeded the BTV even after the additional evaluation was performed. Therefore, iron concentrations at the site were considered to represent background. Arsenic, cobalt, vanadium, CPAHs, and dioxins were carried forward into the site-specific background evaluation. Remember, site-specific background levels are generally established by a responsible party or voluntary party for a smaller area than default background studies. They are established for one or a few specific sites and therefore more accurately represent that site or those sites. They can also be established for both natural and anthropogenic ambient background conditions. Site-specific background may be needed when site concentrations exceed default background, when default background values for the chemical are either not available or not appropriate to use. For example, default background data sets do not have the same physical, chemical, geological, or biological characteristics as the site. They may also be needed when it is a specific type of site that default background may not apply to, for example, a mining site, or when a more refined evaluation is needed even if a default background level is available. Site-specific background takes into consideration the soil present at your site. It uses site-specific information to establish soil background. When conducting a site-specific risk assessment, site-specific soil risk-based values are generally derived as a first step since they are often less conservative than default soil risk-based values and may be less conservative than soil background. For our case study, site concentrations exceeded their applicable site-specific risk-based soil values. Therefore, a site-specific soil background evaluation was necessary. First, we determined an area suitable to use to represent site-specific background. We identified areas around the facility that were unimpacted by facility operations. Remember, you may need to expand your footprint outside of the immediate vicinity to identify appropriate background study area for your site. Here we identified the wooded area east of the facility, which had vacant land with a stream and with similar woods and vegetation as the facility. Also, it is located upwind of the facility and it's undeveloped. We investigated the history of this area to make sure that there were no known sources of contamination. For our case study, the area east of the creek, but not in the mountains, contained similar characteristics as site soils. Once we identified this area closely represented the site being evaluated in physical, chemical, geological, and biological characteristics, we needed to identify specific locations to sample. For more information on sample design for a background study, please refer to video 2. The number of samples to be collected may vary and is dependent upon other considerations. Here we determined that 30 samples were sufficient. We chose locations that were least likely to be impacted by the facility and by specific sources. We analyzed for arsenic, cobalt, vanadium, CPAHs, and dioxins. Then, we used ProUCL software to establish site-specific BTVs and used hypothesis testing to compare the site-specific background dataset to the site datasets for each contaminant. Make sure you consider the various options available, UTL versus USL versus UPL, and pick the most appropriate one to use. Hypothesis testing is also used to compare the entire site-specific background dataset to the site dataset. US EPA's ProUCL software is commonly used to accomplish this step, but other software could be used. Please refer to Section 11, Table 11-5 of the ITRC guidance document for details on the different hypothesis tests, including advantages and disadvantages. Similar to what was done with the default BTV, all of the contaminant concentrations were compared to the site-specific BTV to determine if any exceeded, and if so, how many and by what magnitude. The use of a site-specific BTV allows you to identify localized contamination. This type of comparison is often referred to as a point-by-point comparison. If all of the site concentrations, or the maximum site concentration, are less than the site-specific BTV, site conditions are considered to represent background. If some site concentrations exceed the site-specific BTV, additional evaluations comparing the site dataset to the site-specific BTV are generally useful. These additional evaluations include graphical and spatial comparisons and the test for proportions. Please refer to Section 11 of the Guidance Manual for information on these additional evaluations. Next, we compared the central tendencies of the site and background datasets using a two-sample hypothesis statistical test. In this case, we used ProUCL software to perform the students' t-test. By comparing their central tendencies and variances, it is possible to identify if there may be slight but pervasive contamination. As stated earlier, please refer to Section 11, Table 11-5 of the guidance document for details on the different hypothesis tests, including advantages and disadvantages. Upper bound and central tendency comparisons complement each other and are not an either-or situation. As you can see, the maximum concentration of vanadium at the site is lower than the BTV value. The student's t-test suggests that vanadium at the site is considered to represent site-specific background levels. Therefore, it does not get carried forward in the risk assessment. Arsenic, cobalt, CPAHs, and dioxins get carried forward into the next step of the process, which is the geochemical and environmental forensics assessment. Geochemical evaluations and environmental forensics are often underutilized in human health and ecological risk assessments of soils. However, they can be useful tools in determining whether observed chemical concentrations in site soils may be representative of natural or anthropogenic ambient background. We will not go into detail about how to perform geochemical evaluations and environmental forensics in this training, since they are covered in Video 4 and in the guidance in Sections 5, 6, and 7. It is important to note that these evaluations should only be performed by experienced geochemists and geologists. As a result of the geochemical evaluation, cobalt was found to be representative of background. As a result of the environmental forensics evaluation, CPAHs were found to be representative of the soil background condition. Arsenic and dioxins were not found to be representative of the background condition. Therefore, these chemicals will be carried into the remedial goals selection process. As we begin to select remedial goals for the remaining chemicals in our case study, a quick reminder is to know your regulatory agency. Each agency has their own definitions, requirements, and processes that may differ slightly from the training and the guidance. Typically, when site conditions are associated with unacceptable risks, regulatory agencies will require further action, which might include a response action, and that would include a remedial goal. In some cases, it is reasonable to use soil background as the remedial goal. There are two ways to use soil background to set a remedial goal. Use a default or site-specific BTV, or compare the soil background data set to the site data set to determine whether areas may require a response action. Default or site-specific BTVs may be based on central tendency or upper limit values. This choice is a risk management decision rather than a risk assessment decision. Using a central tendency BTV as a remedial goal is a more conservative approach than using an upper limit BTV, but it is also more likely to result in false positive errors or concluding that a soil sample is contaminated when it represents background. Using an upper limit BTV may be more susceptible to false negative errors or concluding a soil sample is not contaminated when it actually is contaminated. It is important to ensure that both the BTV and site concentration are of the same type of statistics. For example, if a central tendency BTV is used as the remedial goal, then the site concentration for comparison should also be a central tendency. As we saw, arsenic and dioxin were not found to be representative of soil background. These chemicals will need to be addressed as part of the remedial action. For this case study, we used the 95-95 upper tolerance limits, or UTLs, that we established during the site-specific risk assessment as remedial goals. The responsible party cleaned up all the areas where soil, arsenic, or dioxin concentrations exceeded the 95-95 UTL. This concludes our training on default and site-specific background. For information on these topics, as well as the guidance and other training videos, visit the ITRC website.
The Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council is a nonprofit research program of the Environmental Council of the States. ITRC is a state-led organization composed of over 1,000 members from state agencies, federal government, tribal and international organizations, the private sector, academia, and community stakeholders. Members participate in technical teams which produce guidance, tools, resources, and training materials. If you'd like to be a part of ITRC, please visit the ITRC website at itrcweb.org. You can register for teams and learn more about how you can be an active member. ITRC's usage policy is available on the ITRC website. If you do plan to use ITRC materials, we ask that you review that policy in detail and be sure to credit ITRC. ITRC does not warranty the material nor endorse any specific products.